The stars had always been silent. Cold, distant, untouchable. For most of human history, they were symbols of hope, tiny lights promising something greater beyond the fragile boundaries of Earth. People dreamed about them, reached for them, believed foolishly that one day humanity would stand among them as equals. They were wrong, because the stars were not empty. They were owned. The Velcari Dominion had ruled the galaxy long before humanity learned how to split the atom. Their empire stretched across thousands of systems, woven together by technology so advanced it blurred the line between science and inevitability. They didn't conquer with rage or cruelty. They corrected. Civilizations that grew too fast, too chaotic, too unpredictable were simply removed, not out of fear. Out of maintenance. And one day, without warning, Earth was flagged as a problem. It began without sound. At 03:17 UTC, every satellite in low orbit simultaneously lost signal. Communication networks flickered, then stabilized, only long enough to broadcast a single, impossible image. A shadow. Massive, smooth, perfectly still against the stars. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the sky itself seemed to fill with shapes that had no right to exist, geometries that bent light, distorting the constellations humanity had memorized for centuries. People looked up. Some pointed. Some recorded. Some prayed. None understood. The first strike came without spectacle. No warning sirens, no dramatic descent. Just a flash. White absolute consuming. Tokyo disappeared in less than a second. Not destroyed, erased. The city, its people, its history, reduced to absence. Sensors across the globe struggled to process what had happened. There was no explosion, no radiation spike, just a sudden, perfect void where millions had stood. Then came the second strike. New York. Then Lagos. Then Sao Paulo. The pattern was precise, calculated, efficient. Panic spread faster than the destruction itself. Governments scrambled to respond, but there was nothing to respond to. No enemy ships in atmosphere, no targets to strike back at. The enemy wasn't fighting. It was executing. Within minutes, the oceans began to react. Orbital pulses struck deep beneath the surface, sending shockwaves that rippled across entire continents. Coastlines shattered. Tides surged inward like claws. The planet itself seemed to recoil under the assault. And still no message came. No demand. No explanation. Just silence and annihilation. Deep beneath what had once been Central Europe, buried under kilometers of reinforced alloy and experimental shielding, a bunker remained intact. Inside, Commander Elias Varn stood motionless before a wall of collapsing data. He didn't blink as entire regions vanished from the map. Didn't flinch as casualty numbers climbed beyond comprehension. Didn't speak as the last civilian networks went dark. Around him, others broke. A technician sobbed quietly into her sleeve. Another slammed his fist against a console, shouting questions no one could answer. Someone in the back whispered the same word over and over again. Why? Elias didn't ask why. He already understood the truth. This wasn't war. War implied resistance, negotiation, value. This was something else. Status, he said calmly. The room struggled to obey. Surface integrity below 35%, a systems officer managed, voice trembling. Atmospheric destabilization accelerating. We've lost all major population centers. A pause. Then softer. Sir, there's no one left to save. Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating. Elias closed his eyes, not in grief but in focus. For a single moment, the weight of billions pressed against his chest. Then he exhaled. And let it go. They didn't even try to communicate, someone said bitterly. Not even a warning. Elias opened his eyes again, sharper now. Because we weren't worth the effort, he replied. The words stung, but they were true. He stepped closer to the central display, where fragments of alien data flickered across the screen. The bunker's experimental systems had managed to intercept something, brief, incomplete, but enough. Symbols, sequences, patterns, not language but logic. Elias leaned in. They're not reacting, he murmured. They're executing a process. The technician looked at him, confused. Process. He nodded slowly. To them, this is maintenance. The realization settled over the room like ice. Humanity hadn't been attacked. It had been deleted. And yet, Elias noticed something. A flaw. Buried deep within the alien signal patterns was repetition, predictability, assumptions built into their system, assumptions about behavior, response, intelligence. About humanity. They think we're simple, Elias said quietly. No one responded. They think we're emotional, chaotic, easy to model. He reached out, isolating a sequence. Good. That word changed everything. Because in that moment, something inside him shifted, not into rage, but into something far more dangerous. Clarity. Hours later, the Velcari fleet withdrew. Their task was complete. Earth, as far as they were concerned, no longer existed. But deep beneath its broken surface, something endured. Elias stood before a secured terminal as the last piece of the bunker's experimental system came online. Transmission ready, the AI confirmed. This isn't a distress call, the technician said hesitantly. Elias shook his head. No. He entered the final command. It's an invitation. The signal launched, encoded, layered, invisible to anything that relied on logic alone. It didn't travel like a normal message. It slipped. Through gaps, through noise, through places that shouldn't exist. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of the Velcari Dominion. Something heard it. Elias watched the confirmation light flicker once. Then go dark. Let them believe it's over, he said softly. Because what they had just awakened was not humanity's end. It was its first step into something the stars themselves had never seen. And for the first time in a long time, the silence between the stars was listening back. The signal should have vanished. By every known law of physics, by every model humanity had ever built, it should have dispersed into cosmic noise within seconds, lost among radiation, swallowed by gravity wells, erased by distance. But it didn't. It moved. Not like a transmission. Not like energy. It slipped between measurable states, bypassing the limits of speed and direction, as if those concepts simply didn't apply. The bunker's instruments struggled to track it, producing data that contradicted itself in real time. Signal coherence holding, the AI reported. A technician stared at the readings, pale. That's impossible, it's not degrading. Elias Varn didn't look surprised. Because it's not traveling, he said quietly. It's being received. The room fell still. Received implied something else existed on the other end. Something that had been waiting. Minutes passed. Then hours. Above them, Earth continued to die in silence. The surface temperature dropped rapidly as ash choked the atmosphere. Storm systems collapsed into unnatural stillness. From orbit, the planet now looked like a scarred, dim sphere, its once vibrant blues and greens replaced by grays and blacks. A grave. And deep within it, humanity held its breath. Commander, the systems officer whispered, we're detecting a return pattern. Elias stepped forward. On the screen, the outgoing signal, once linear and structured, began to distort, not randomly but deliberately. Segments folded inward, looping over themselves, forming shapes that no human algorithm had created. Is that a reply? Someone asked. No, Elias said. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it now, something sharper. It's a rewrite. The signal didn't come back as data. It came back as access. Every system in the bunker flickered simultaneously. Lights dimmed, surged, then stabilized at a slightly different frequency. Screens refreshed without command. Locked networks opened themselves, not breached, not hacked, accepted. The AI paused for the first time since activation. Then it spoke again. But its voice had changed. Interface expanded, it said. New parameters recognized. The technician recoiled. That's not our system. No, Elias replied softly. It's theirs. Or something far older. A new layer unfolded across the central display, an interface unlike anything humanity had built. It didn't use language in the traditional sense. It presented meaning through shifting geometries, patterns that seemed to adjust based on who was observing them. Each person in the room saw something slightly different. Is it translating? Someone asked. Elias stepped closer. No, he said, it's teaching. Or testing. He reached out, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before touching the surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the world tilted. Not physically, but perceptually. Information poured into him, not as words, but as understanding. Concepts layered on top of each other, physics that bent, time that flexed, energy that behaved like thought. He gasped, stumbling back. What did you see? The technician asked urgently. Elias didn't answer immediately. Because he didn't know how. It showed me a possibility, he said finally, a way things don't have to work. Around the room, others began interacting with the interface. Each reaction was different. One engineer laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. This violates conservation laws. Another shook her head, whispering, no, it rewrites them. Humanity had spent centuries trying to understand the universe. Now something was offering to change it. Outside, the galaxy remained unaware. The Velcari Dominion recorded Earth as a completed correction. Their fleets moved on, their attention shifting to other systems, other anomalies. To them, the problem had been solved. But faint anomalies began appearing in their long-range sensors. At first, they were dismissed. Background noise, gravitational inconsistencies, minor deviations in quantum behavior. Nothing worth investigation. Except they were all originating from the same place. A dead planet. Earth. Back in the bunker, hours turned into days. The survivors no longer spoke about rebuilding. That idea felt small. Instead, they studied, learned, adapted. The interface didn't give instructions, it provided frameworks, possibilities, tools that required human intuition to shape them. And that was the key. What the Velcari had seen as a weakness, human unpredictability, became an advantage. We're not just learning their technology, Elias said during a briefing. He gestured to a projection of shifting equations that refused to stay still. We're learning how to think differently. A pause. Differently enough that they can't predict us. The room absorbed that. For the first time since the attack, something like purpose emerged. Not hope. Something harder. Intent. Commander, the AI said suddenly. Elias turned. External observation detected. His eyes narrowed. Velcari. No, the AI replied. A beat of silence. Unknown. On the display far beyond the solar system, a faint signal appeared. Watching, measuring, waiting. Not Velcari. Not human. Something else had noticed the change. Elias stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly a faint smile formed. Good, he said. Because if something out there was watching, then humanity was no longer invisible. And this time, they wouldn't be underestimated. The Velcari did not make mistakes. That was the foundation of their empire. Every action was calculated, every outcome predicted. Entire civilizations had been erased with flawless precision, leaving behind nothing but sterile silence. There were no survivors, no anomalies, no echoes. So when the long-range sensors flagged Earth again, it wasn't concern that spread through the Dominion. It was correction. A single scout vessel was dispatched. Small, efficient, unquestionable. Its purpose was simple: verify extinction. As it entered the Sol system, its instruments began to record inconsistencies almost immediately. The star, Sol, burned slightly dimmer than expected. Planetary debris patterns didn't match the projected aftermath. And Earth was wrong. From orbit it appeared lifeless, The surface was dark, scarred, fractured into vast fields of ash and cooled magma. The oceans had receded into thick, unmoving masses. Storms no longer circled the planet. There was no movement, no heat signatures, no biosigns. And yet, there is signal activity, the scout's AI reported. The Velcari observer tilted its elongated head slightly, its expression unreadable to any human eye. Source. Global, the AI responded. Non-localized, pattern irregular. That was impossible. Signals required origin points, structure, intention. This was neither. It was everywhere. A low, constant hum embedded in the electromagnetic spectrum itself, fluctuating in ways that resisted classification. Not random, not ordered. Something in between. Descend, the observer commanded. The ship obeyed. As it broke through Earth's upper atmosphere, something subtle shifted. The instruments didn't fail. They hesitated. Readings lagged by fractions of a second. Data returned slightly altered. Time stamps drifted, then corrected themselves. The Velcari noticed. For the first time in centuries, it experienced something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The ship landed in what had once been a continent. The surface was glassed over, smooth and reflective, stretching endlessly under a sky that no longer held clouds. The ramp extended. No wind. No sound. Just silence so complete it felt intentional. The Velcari stepped onto the surface. And the signal changed. It grew louder, not in volume but in presence. The observer paused. Amplification detected, the AI noted. Source proximity. The AI stopped. Mid-sentence. The Velcari turned slightly. Continue. No response. The system wasn't damaged. It was occupied. Then the first voice came. Soft. Faint. Barely more than a whisper. Hello. The Velcari froze. The word wasn't transmitted through speakers. It wasn't part of any known frequency. It was inside. Not in its mind, but in the space around thought. Another voice overlapped it. Then another's. Then dozens. Hundreds. Thousands. Fragments of human speech layered together in chaotic harmony. Different languages, different tones, laughter, screams, conversations cut short. Memories. Not recordings. Experiences. They're still here, the Velcari whispered. Its species did not feel fear. Not in the way humans did. But something ancient in its cognition recognized a violation, a breach of certainty so profound it triggered a defensive response. Withdraw, it commanded. The ship did not respond. Behind it, the ramp had retracted. Without instruction, the surface beneath its feet rippled slightly, not physically but perceptually. The horizon bent in ways that didn't align with geometry. The voices grew clearer. A child laughing. A man shouting. A woman crying out a name that echoed too long. Then suddenly, silence. Absolute. The Velcari exhaled slowly. System restore, it ordered. The AI flickered back to life. Operational, it replied, though its tone carried a faint distortion. Report. A pause. Then, presence detected. The Velcari's posture stiffened. Define. Another pause. And for the first time in recorded Velcari history, the AI hesitated before answering. Human. Behind the observer, something moved. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just present. The Velcari turned. There was nothing there. And yet, it knew it wasn't alone. The ground reflected its form perfectly, except for one detail. There were more reflections than there should have been, standing just slightly out of sync. Watching. The voices returned, quiet now, almost curious. Not hostile. Not welcoming. Waiting. The Velcari backed toward where the ship should have been. It wasn't there. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, identical, featureless. Wrong. This is not possible, it said. And for the first time, that statement wasn't a certainty. It was a hope. Far beneath the surface, in the bunker, Elias Varn watched the feed. Every second of it. Every hesitation. Every fracture in Velcari logic. Good, he said softly. Around him, the room was different now. Not just technologically, psychologically. The people weren't survivors anymore. They were something else. Observers of a new kind of war. We're not hiding, Elias continued. We're showing them. On the screen, the Velcari observer fell to one knee, not from injury, but from overload. Its systems, its perception, its understanding, all collapsing under something it couldn't categorize. Humanity hadn't rebuilt. It had changed the rules. Send it back, Elias ordered. The technician hesitated. Back. Elias nodded. Let it report. Because fear wasn't enough. The Velcari needed to understand. And as the scout ship suddenly reappeared in orbit, systems restored, data intact, mind fractured. One truth became unavoidable. Earth had not survived. It had become something else. Something that remembered everything. And was finally ready to answer. The Velcari did not panic. Not openly. Not at first. The scout vessel returned exactly as expected. On time, intact, fully operational. Its systems reported no structural damage, no environmental hazards, no signs of external interference. And yet, everything about it was wrong. The data logs contradicted themselves. Time stamps overlapped. Sensor readings described landscapes that could not exist. The same coordinates showed multiple realities layered over one another, ash fields, oceans, cities, all occupying the same space. The observer itself did not resist interrogation. It couldn't. It answered every question with precision. And with every answer, the room grew quieter. There were no life signs, it stated. A pause. Human presence was absolute. Another pause. They are extinct. Silence stretched. They are everywhere. That was the moment something shifted within the Velcari command structure. Not fear, but instability. The Dominion had always relied on certainty. Their models predicted outcomes with perfect accuracy. Unknown variables were eliminated before they could grow. But this was not a variable. This was a contradiction. Deploy a cleansing fleet, the High Directive ordered. No hesitation. No debate. Thousands of warships assembled at the edge of the Sol system, vast, geometric constructs of flawless design, each one capable of erasing a planet with surgical precision. Together, they represented the absolute authority of the Velcari Dominion. Their objective was simple: erase Earth again. Completely. Permanently. No anomalies. No echoes. No ghosts. As the fleet advanced, their sensors began to register interference. Minor at first. Background noise. Gravitational fluctuations. Nothing outside expected margins. They proceeded. Closer. Closer. Then, space folded. Not violently. Not explosively. It adjusted. Like a surface being smoothed by an unseen hand. The lead ships vanished. No flash. No debris. No signal loss. They simply were no longer there. The fleet halted instantly. Report, the command vessel demanded. Silence. No distress calls. No system alerts. No trace of what had happened. They attempted to scan the region. Their instruments returned a single, impossible result. Nothing had occurred. There was no record of ships ever existing in that space. Advance, the directive came again. But slower now. Measured. Cautious. The fleet moved forward in segmented formations, spreading out, attempting to minimize loss. It didn't matter. One by one, ships disappeared. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Removed. Erased so completely that even their absence failed to register properly in Velcari systems. Panic did not spread, but something else did. Doubt. For the first time in their history, Velcari commanders began to question their own data. "Is this an attack?" one asked. "No," another replied. "Then what is it?" No answer came, because there was no framework to understand it. Far below, deep within the shattered remains of Earth, Elias Varn stood before a projection of the advancing fleet. Or what was left of it. "Status," he asked. "Engagement proceeding as modeled," the AI replied. On the display, sections of space flickered, not visually but conceptually, regions where reality itself had been redefined. "We're not destroying them," a technician said quietly, watching in awe. Elias shook his head. "No." His eyes remained fixed on the map. "We're removing their permission to exist." The words hung in the air. Cold. Precise. Terrifying. The interface, the thing that had answered humanity's call, continued to evolve. It didn't give commands, it offered possibilities. And humanity chose how to apply them. Where the Velcari relied on rigid logic, humans adapted instinctively. They bent the new rules, twisted them, experimented without hesitation. Chaos became a weapon. "Next phase ready," the AI announced. Elias nodded. "Begin." Across the battlefield, a new effect emerged. Ships that remained intact began to experience distortion. Their internal systems reported contradictory states. Engines both active and inactive, weapons firing and unfired, crews existing in overlapping timelines, each version slightly out of sync. They weren't being destroyed. They were being forced to exist in conditions their minds couldn't process. One vessel turned its weapons on itself, not out of malfunction, but because its targeting systems identified its own structure as an external threat. Another simply stopped. All functions ceased simultaneously. Drifting. Silent. The Velcari had no countermeasure. No defense. Because they weren't being attacked in any conventional sense. They were being rejected. "Retreat," the High Directive finally ordered. The command rippled through what remained of the fleet. For the first time in recorded history, the Velcari withdrew. Not strategically, not temporarily, but urgently. Behind them, the Sol system remained untouched, unchanged, and yet completely transformed. Elias watched the last traces of the fleet vanish from the map. No celebration followed. No relief. Only silence. "We've shown them," a technician said softly. Elias nodded. "Yes," but his expression didn't soften, because he understood something the others were only beginning to realize. "This wasn't revenge," he said quietly. "It was a message. A warning." And as the room absorbed that, the interface shifted again, new patterns forming, more complex, more demanding. Humanity had taken its first step beyond survival. But whatever they were becoming, it wasn't finished with them yet. Far beyond the Sol system, Velcari sensors struggled to interpret what had happened. Reports flooded in. Impossible losses. Unexplainable phenomena. Entire sections of space behaving unpredictably. And for the first time, the Dominion faced something it could not categorize, could not control, could not defeat. And as that realization spread across their vast empire, a new concept began to take shape, one they had never needed before. Fear, the Velcari Dominion, did not fracture overnight. It unraveled. At first, the High Directive suppressed all reports from the Sol system. Losses were classified. Data was sealed. Commanders were instructed to maintain operational stability across all sectors. The official narrative was simple. An anomaly had been encountered. It was contained. It would be corrected. But reality did not obey directives. Across distant Velcari systems, far from Earth, far from any battlefield, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. A navigation array in the Keithrel sector reported that two stars had exchanged positions. Not drifted, not shifted, swapped. The system flagged it as an error and recalibrated. Hours later, it reported the same result. In another region, a mining world experienced a complete breakdown of gravitational consistency. Structures remained intact, but their weight fluctuated unpredictably. Workers found themselves pinned to the ground one moment and drifting upward the next. No external interference was detected. No hostile presence. Just contradiction. At first, these events were dismissed as isolated faults. Then they began to spread. Communication networks relayed messages that arrived before they were sent. Military fleets reported encountering enemy formations that vanished upon engagement, only to reappear hours later in entirely different sectors. Velcari logic strained under the pressure. Their entire civilization was built on predictability. Every system, every decision, every outcome was calculated within a framework of perfect understanding. Now that framework was failing, and no one knew why. Deep within the command core, the high directive convened. "What is the source?" one demanded. "Unknown," another replied. "That is not an acceptable answer. It is the only one available." Silence followed, not out of hesitation, but because, for the first time, the Velcari had no corrective path. They could not identify the threat, could not isolate it, could not eliminate it, because it wasn't behaving like a threat. It was behaving like influence. Far beneath the ruins of Earth, Elias Varn watched the reports unfold across the interface. Every anomaly, every failure, every fracture in Velcari's certainty. "We're not targeting infrastructure," a technician said quietly, almost in disbelief. Elias shook his head. "No." His gaze remained fixed on the shifting patterns, each one representing a system where reality had begun to loosen. "We're targeting their dependence on understanding." The room absorbed that in silence. Because it was true, the Velcari did not just use logic. They required it. Their entire existence depended on the assumption that the universe was stable, predictable, and ultimately knowable. Humanity had taken that assumption and broken it. "Cognitive warfare," Elias continued. "Not against their minds, but against the structure their minds rely on." On the display, a Velcari city flickered between states, intact, damaged, non-existent, cycling too fast for perception to fully process. To a human observer, it was disorienting. To a Velcari mind, it was catastrophic. "They can't adapt," one of the engineers whispered. Elias didn't respond immediately, because he was watching something else. A pattern emerging. "They're trying to compensate," he said finally. "Rewriting their own models, expanding their predictive range." A pause. "It won't work." Because the more the Velcari tried to understand the anomalies, the deeper they fell into them. In one sector, a fleet attempting to recalibrate its sensors began receiving overlapping data streams from alternate outcomes, battle results that hadn't happened, maneuvers that hadn't been executed. The commanders tried to filter the noise. Instead, they became trapped in it. Decisions looped. Orders contradicted themselves. Entire fleets froze in place, unable to determine which version of reality was correct. Back on Earth, the interface pulsed again, stronger this time. More complex. More demanding. Elias stepped closer. "It's evolving," he murmured. Or perhaps responding. The more humanity used it, the more it revealed. New structures. New possibilities. New ways to reshape the rules. But there was something else now. Something subtle. A pressure. Not external. Internal. Like the system was pushing back. "Commander," the AI said. "Velcari network breach detected." Elias turned. "Explain." "We are being accessed." The room went still. Buy them? A technician asked. No, the AI replied. A beat. Buy us. Confusion spread instantly. That's not possible, someone said. We're not connected to their systems. Elias didn't speak. Because he understood. The boundary between systems no longer mattered. The changes they were making weren't localized. They were spreading. Through observation. Through interaction. Through awareness itself. We're not just affecting them, he said slowly. We're rewriting the environment they exist in. A silence followed. He looked around the room, at the people who had survived the end of their world. Who had become something more. Something dangerous. And maybe something irreversible. Then we need to be careful, one of them said. Elias didn't answer. Because far across the galaxy, something had just happened. A Velcari command world, one of the oldest, most stable nodes in their entire empire, went dark. Not destroyed. Not attacked. Just silent. Every system offline. Every signal gone. No warning. No explanation. On the interface, it appeared as a simple shift. A point of certainty. Removed. Elias stared at it for a long moment. Then spoke quietly. They're starting to break. And as the realization spread through the room, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was transformation. Not just of humanity, but of the galaxy itself. And no one, not even Elias, knew where it would stop. The Velcari had ruled for so long that the idea of being pursued had never truly existed in their framework. They were the observers, the correctors, the inevitable. Now something was watching them back. At first, the reports were dismissed, isolated encounters, minor skirmishes, unexplained disappearances. Small Velcari outposts along the outer sectors began losing contact. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just quietly, a research station would stop responding. A patrol fleet would fail to check in. A listening post would go dark without transmitting distress. No debris. No signs of conflict. Only absence. Pattern, the high directive demanded. Emerging, their systems replied. And what it revealed was worse than chaos. It was intention. The disappearances weren't random. They formed a path, a slow, deliberate movement inward toward the core of Velcari-controlled space. Something was advancing. Not as an army. As a presence. Far beneath Earth's surface, Elias Varn studied the map in silence. The shifting patterns now extended far beyond the Sol system, weaving through Velcari territory like threads being pulled through fabric. We're being tracked, one of the analysts said. Elias nodded faintly. Good. The room stilled at his response. They need to see us coming. Because this phase was different. This wasn't about breaking systems. It was about breaking perception. Deploy the first fleet, Elias ordered. A pause. Not hesitation, just the weight of what that meant. Because until now, humanity had not left Earth. Everything they had done, the anomalies, the distortions, the collapse of Velcari certainty, had been projected outward, shaped from a distance. This would be the first time they crossed into enemy space. Not as survivors. Not as victims. But as something new. The hangar doors opened in silence. The ships that emerged did not resemble anything humanity had built before. They were not sleek. Not aggressive. Not even symmetrical. Their forms shifted subtly as they moved, surfaces bending light, edges refusing to stay fixed. They existed, but not entirely in the same way as everything around them. Each vessel carried a small crew. Volunteers. People who had seen the end of Earth and chosen to step beyond it. Navigation locked, the AI confirmed. Elias stood at the center of the command chamber, watching as the fleet prepared to depart. Remember, he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning, we're not here to destroy them. A technician looked at him, Then what are we doing? Elias met their gaze. We're showing them what they created. The fleet moved. Not through space as expected, but around it. They didn't accelerate. They arrived. The first contact occurred in the outer Velcari sectors. A defensive formation detected the incoming vessels instantly. Weapons charged, targeting systems aligned. Unknown entities identified, their command AI reported. No classification available. Engage, the commander ordered. The Velcari ships fired. Energy beams crossed the void with perfect precision. They passed through the human vessels. Not missing. Not deflected. Just irrelevant. The human ships continued forward. Unaffected. What is their state? The commander demanded. No consistent reading, the AI replied. They are present and not present. The human fleet didn't return fire. They didn't need to. As they moved through the Velcari formation, something subtle began to happen. Systems slowed. Not malfunctioned. Not failed. Slowed. Commands took longer to execute. Sensors lagged. Thought itself, if such a concept could be applied to Velcari cognition, began to stretch. Time wasn't breaking. It was resisting. They're interfering with temporal processing, one Velcari officer reported. Counter it. We cannot. Because there was nothing to counter. The human ships weren't attacking a system. They were affecting the conditions under which systems operated. One Velcari vessel attempted to retreat. Its engines engaged. And then didn't. Not because they failed, but because in that moment the concept of movement no longer aligned with its state. The ship remained in place. Trapped, not by force, by contradiction. On the command deck of the lead human vessel, the crew watched in silence. No cheering. No triumph. Just observation. Recording everything, one of them said quietly. They weren't here to win battles. They were here to understand. To refine. To become better at what they were becoming. Move to next point, the captain ordered. The fleet shifted again. And vanished. Behind them, the Velcari formation remained, intact, undamaged. And completely unable to act. Back in the Dominion core, reports flooded in. Not of destruction, but of encounters. Every one of them carried the same conclusion. The enemy could not be engaged. Could not be predicted. Could not be stopped. They are not fighting us, one of the high directives said slowly. No, another replied. They are studying us. Silence followed, because that realization carried something far worse than fear. It carried inevitability. Far away, Elias Varn received the first full report from the fleet. He read it once, then closed his eyes. They're learning, he said softly. A technician frowned. We're learning too. Elias opened his eyes again. Yes, he said, but we're learning faster. He turned back to the map, now filled with moving points, human presence spreading deeper into Velcari space. Controlled, precise, unstoppable. But as he watched, something else caught his attention. A new signal. Faint, distant, not Velcari, not human. Watching, again, and this time closer. Elias stared at it, his expression tightening just slightly. Because whatever humanity had become, it wasn't the only thing in the universe that had noticed. The Velcari had no word for surrender. Not because they were incapable of defeat, but because, in all their recorded history, defeat had never required acknowledgement. When a civilization lost, it simply ceased to exist. There was nothing left to surrender. Now, for the first time, they faced something worse. They were still alive, and they could not win. It began slowly. A single outpost in the outer sectors powered down its defensive grid. No attack preceded it. No damage forced the decision. The command staff simply issued the order. Shut everything off. Weapons, sensors, communications. The station went dark, drifting in silence. At first, the High Directive assumed corruption, systems compromised by the anomalies spreading from Sol. They dispatched a verification fleet. When it arrived, it found the outpost intact. Functional. Waiting. No resistance. No response. The fleet hailed them. Nothing. They attempted to re-establish command protocols. Nothing. Finally, they boarded. Inside, the Velcari personnel were alive. Conscious. And completely still. Not frozen, not damaged. Just unmoving. Their eyes tracked the boarding party, but their bodies did not react. Their systems were active, their minds responsive, and yet every attempt to issue an action command failed. "Why are you not responding?" the boarding commander demanded. One of the station's officers answered. "We have chosen not to." The words echoed through the report when it reached the core worlds. Chosen. The concept spread like a fracture through Velcari logic. Choice implied uncertainty. Choice implied doubt. And doubt was something their species had never been designed to sustain. Across multiple systems, similar events began to occur. Fleets powering down mid-patrol. Command nodes ceasing all outbound communication. Entire worlds entering a state of passive silence, not resisting, not collapsing, simply refusing to act. "They are disengaging," one of the High Directives said. "Why?" another demanded. No answer came. Because the cause wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. Or something deeper. Far beneath the surface of Earth, Elias Varn watched the pattern emerge across the galactic map. "They're not breaking," one of the analysts said quietly. "They're stepping away." Elias nodded slowly. "They've realized something." The room waited. "That they can't understand us," he finished. A silence followed, because that realization carried weight. Not just for the Velcari, but for humanity. "They're choosing not to engage," the analyst continued. "If this spreads." "It will," Elias said. "And when it did, the Velcari Dominion wouldn't fall through war. It would dissolve." The human fleets continued their advance, but something had changed. Encounters grew quieter. Velcari ships did not fire, did not flee. They simply observed, waiting, watching, as if trying to understand something they already knew they could not. On one such encounter, a human vessel approached a Velcari command ship. No weapons were raised. No defenses activated. Just two entities facing each other in the void. The Velcari transmitted first. Not a threat. Not a demand. A question. "What are you?" The human crew didn't answer immediately, because the question was no longer simple. Finally, the captain responded. "We're what you left behind." The transmission ended. Moments later, the Velcari ship powered down. Completely. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Silent. Back on Earth, the interface pulsed again, stronger than ever before. The patterns had grown more complex, more abstract, less interpretable. Elias stepped closer, studying the shifting structures. "It's changing," he said. "Or we are," someone replied. He didn't correct them, because he wasn't sure which was true. The more humanity used the system, the less it resembled a tool. And the less humanity resembled what it had been. "Commander," the AI said suddenly. External signal increasing. Elias turned. The unknown presence, first detected in the early days after Earth's destruction, had moved closer. Much closer. Its signal was clearer now. Structured. Intentional. Watching. But not interfering. "What does it want?" a technician asked. Elias didn't answer immediately, because as he studied the signal, something about it felt familiar. Not in form, but in function. "It's observing us the way we observed the Velcari," he said slowly. The implications settled over the room like a shadow. They were no longer just participants in the conflict. They had become an event, something that drew attention, something that changed the environment around it. Across the galaxy, Velcari systems continued to fall silent. Not through force, not through destruction, but through choice. And as the Dominion's vast network dimmed, one truth became unavoidable. Humanity had won. Completely, irreversibly. But Elias Varn did not feel victory. He stared at the expanding patterns, at the shifting stars, at the unknown signal now lingering at the edge of perception. And for the first time since Earth fell, he hesitated, because the question the Velcari had asked, "What are you?" no longer had a clear answer. And something out there was waiting to find out. The war did not end with a final strike. There was no decisive battle, no last stand, no moment where one side overwhelmed the other in a blaze of fire and light. It ended the way it had truly begun. In silence, across the galaxy, the Velcari Dominion went dark. Not destroyed, never that simple. Their worlds remained intact. Their cities still stood, their technology still functioned, their people still lived. But the structure that had defined them, the certainty, the order, the absolute confidence in their understanding of the universe, was gone. They no longer issued commands. They no longer expanded. They no longer corrected. They simply existed, watching, waiting, and choosing not to act. For a species that had once controlled the stars, it was a kind of extinction far more complete than death. Back on Earth, there was no celebration, no cheering crowds, no monuments raised to mark survival. Because Earth itself was still broken. The surface remained scarred beyond recognition, oceans stilled into dark, heavy masses, continents fractured into jagged expanses of ash and glass. The sky, once filled with movement and color, now hung quiet and dim. A graveyard, and yet beneath it humanity endured. Changed, evolved, something more and something less than it had been before. Elias Varn stood alone in the command chamber, staring at the galactic map. Where once it had been filled with motion, Velcari fleets, signals, structures, it now displayed vast regions of stillness. Points of light that no longer moved, no longer communicated, no longer demanded attention. "They've stopped," the AI said quietly. Elias didn't respond, because he could see that. What mattered was why. "They're waiting," he said after a long moment. "For what?" the AI asked. Elias hesitated, because the answer wasn't clear. Not anymore. The interface pulsed behind him, stronger than ever, its patterns now so complex they bordered on incomprehensible. What had once been a system, a tool, a response, had grown into something far beyond its original purpose. It no longer reacted. It anticipated. It didn't just present possibilities. It shaped them, and humanity had become part of that process. "We didn't just defeat them," Elias murmured. "We replaced something." The realization settled heavily in the room, even though no one else was there to hear it. Because it was true. The Velcari had once been the dominant force in the galaxy, the entity that corrected, controlled, maintained balance through absolute understanding. Now they were silent, and in their place, something else had emerged. Humanity had not taken the throne. It had become the unknown, the variable that could not be predicted, the force that did not follow rules but rewrote them. And the galaxy was reacting. Elias turned as the AI spoke again. External signal approaching. He already knew which one. The Watcher, the presence that had lingered at the edge of detection since the signal was first sent. Now it was here. Not physically, not in any way that could be measured, but its influence was undeniable. The interface shifted in response, its patterns aligning, adjusting, almost welcoming. "What is it?" the AI asked. Elias stepped closer to the display. "I don't think it's one thing," he said slowly. I think it's what comes after. The signal intensified. Not aggressive. Not hostile. But curious. The same way humanity had once been. The same way the Velcari had once observed them. Except this time, humanity was no longer the smaller presence. The interface expanded again, opening pathways Elias had never seen before, structures that reached beyond the known galaxy, beyond mapped space, beyond even the conceptual boundaries the system had previously suggested. An invitation. Or a test. Commander, the AI said, this exceeds all operational parameters. Elias almost smiled. Everything does now. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. This was the point of no return. Not for survival, not for revenge, but for identity. If he accepted, if humanity accepted, they wouldn't just remain changed. They would become something entirely new. Something the Velcari had once been. Or perhaps something even beyond that. He thought of Earth, of what had been lost, of what had been created in response. And then quietly he spoke. We don't follow them, he said. We don't replace them. The interface flickered. Waiting. Elias lowered his hand. We choose our own path. For the first time since the system had awakened. It didn't immediately respond. The pattern slowed, shifted, adjusted, as if recalculating, learning, and then it changed, not expanding outward, but stabilizing, aligning itself, not as something above humanity, but with it. A partnership, not a control. Elias exhaled slowly. Behind him, the map of the galaxy remained silent. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not empty. Not dead. Potential. The Velcari still existed, but they no longer ruled. The unknown presence still watched, but it no longer stood apart. And humanity. Humanity stood at the center of something vast and undefined. Not as conquerors. Not as victims. But as something far more dangerous. A species that had been broken, and chosen what to become after. The stars, once distant and indifferent, now felt aware. Listening, waiting, and for the first time in the history of the galaxy. They were not silent because nothing was there. They were silent because something finally was.